Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Information Governance is Too Important to be Left in the Hands of Humans. My name is Teresa Resick, and I'm the Director of Webinars at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. And joining me today are John Mancini, also of AIIM, and Mike Safar from opentext. opentext is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them very much for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. As we get started, just want to offer a few tips for participating in today's webinar with us. By joining live, you can certainly resize the different windows you have in front of you. Do open the group chat, and that way you can message with each other and also with us here at AIIM. Download the resources we have for you. There's a lot of really cool links and to some cool ebooks and great resources in there. Ask questions of our speakers with the Q&A feature, and we'll hold them until the end, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. And we do have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of the discussion today. There will be a survey later in the webinar, and I greatly value your feedback. And so, and I would just ask you to take that survey and to provide that feedback. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. I do want to introduce our speakers we have with us. Very pleased to have John Mancini here, and he is the Chief Evangelist of AIIM, and he is a well-known author and speaker on information management and digital transformation. And as a frequent keynote speaker, John offers his expertise on digital transformation and the struggle to overcome information chaos with intelligent information management. John has published scores of ebooks and research reports, many of which can be found at AIIM.org/research. And also very pleased to introduce Mike Safar. And Mike leads product marketing for opentext information governance products, and he serves as a subject matter expert on information governance solutions and best practices. Mike has over 25 years of experience, starting with integrated document management, records systems, and most recently, intelligent content analytics solutions. So with a very fine cast of speakers here today, I'm going to turn things over to John Mancini to begin our talk. John?
Great, Teresa. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for some people that might be on the West Coast. I'm in lovely Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful day today. We're just 2 hours up the road from the University of Virginia, national champions, for those of you that have been following the basketball tournament, and a place to which I sent many tuition dollars over the years, so it's good to get that kind of ROI out of it. We're here to talk a little bit today about information governance, talk about, in particular, why this is so challenging right now. And that was kind of the logic behind the title here. Information governance is too important to be left in the hands of humans. And so what I thought we'd do today is I would play the role of teeing up some data points from some of our industry research. And Mike Safar, who, as Teresa said, has 25 years of experience, I've asked Mike, I've clued him in on some of the data points I'd be covering, and asked him to think a little bit about some of the approaches and some of the issues to consider relative to addressing them. So what I thought I'd start with first is this point of why things are different, why things are changed from what they once were. And I've spoken about this in a number of different places, but it's always worth emphasizing as to how the universe has changed. And so this is a data point from a survey that I did late last year in which I asked a pretty simple question of about 500 decision makers within end-user organizations. And I said, just think about the huge amounts of data and information currently coming into your organization, and call that X, and what do you predict that volume is going to be in 2 years? And what you can see here is, a rather stunning forecast of the volume of data and information coming into organizations. If you average all this out, it basically comes out to, if it's X now, people on average expected to be 4.2X in 2 years. That was somewhat stunning to me because that was even a more rapid rate of growth than I think anybody had even anticipated. But there's another dimension to that, which I think is, particularly germane to the conversation today. I noticed that a lot of vendors on the RPA side had started to resurrect a data point that we've used a lot in the content space for, for like 2 decades. And anybody who's been in the content space can almost recite this data point by heart, which is that 80% of the information in an organization is unstructured, and by that we mean information that doesn't fit neatly into the rows and columns of a database. And the unfortunate part about that data point is that no one can produce, and I tried, believe me, I had bounties on my blog, all sorts of things. Nobody can produce that data point. And so I decided it'd be useful to ask that question again and maybe get some empirical basis for what seems to be common knowledge, what seems to be a data point that makes sense. And so I asked this question to folks. And again, this points to this importance of, trying to figure out new approaches to the problem. Because if information is going from X to 4.2X, then the question arises, well, what's that composition? So I said, think about all the information in your organization, and what would be your best guess for the percentage of the total that is unstructured or semi-structured information? And if you average out the data points on this slide, it comes out to about 62%. So the urban legend of 80-20, unstructured, structured, isn't exactly right, but it's almost right, which says that this is a complicated problem. And it's a complicated problem because it has massive scale, and it's a complicated problem because it has massive variety associated with it. And so, Mike, I thought I'd get your take, just as we start to think about this, in terms of, some of your thoughts, just as we get started here, about some of the considerations that people ought to have as they manage and think about enterprise data.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. And I'm in chilly Chicago today. And what I notice about that data really is that a lot of people focus on the volume of the data. But actually, there's an opportunity here. And the opportunity is to focus on how you can combine that structured data with the unstructured data to get a handle on your information governance overall. It may be most of the terabytes of data that you have, but it's not necessarily true that it's the most important by 80% or any other majority figure like that. In fact, a lot of that data can be reduced. I've seen as much as, calls for 50% of the data is raw trivial data. So a lot of organizations are focused on file shares and SharePoint, but really structured data is driving the business processes and the workflows. And what you can do is find ways, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, of how to combine this data together to get the most out of it and be able to drive your information governance and your information security policies out of it. We also don't want to forget that structured data also is part of the retention policy, and it needs a compliance plan on top of it. Getting rid of the data really means being able to, the rot means being able to identify what it is. And sometimes identifying what it is means that you have to dig into the document and look at more than just the file folder or the SharePoint site that it's on. So, John, those are my first set of considerations.
Mike, when I look at some of these thoughts, the couple things that really strike me is, this idea that structured and unstructured information needs to be considered holistically, because we've often had these like artificial divisions between the two,
yep.
And while there's some unique challenges associated with unstructured information, they're really all part of a whole, and
right.
That I think is a real important consideration moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the 3 questions that I wanted to tee up and kind of give folks a little bit of a preview on them. The first one is I want to talk a little bit about, some signposts, if you will, some warning signs that the traditional ways that we've approached the governance question are failing. Then secondly, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about like where we see some of those pressure points, and then talk a little bit about automating the governance process, and why that's so incredibly important to solving the problems that are ahead. So a few data points to ponder. For this one, we start here with how big, pretty basic question, how big a problem is information overloaded and information chaos in your organization? And again, this is about 300 or 400 organizations, basically came back, and you can see the bars in red there, and you add those up, and that's 75% of organizations understand that they have a problem. So that's a good first sign, because it indicates if there's an awareness of the problem, then often organizations then are driven to actually do something about it. So Mike talked earlier about this point about redundant, obsolete, and trivial data in organizations. And this is a huge problem as organizations think about that 4.2x problem and that 62% unstructured problem that I talked about earlier, is that, everybody can agree that they ought to get rid of redundant, obsolete, and trivial information and content. But the challenge is that nobody can quite exactly agree as to what it is. And yet when you do systematic surveys, and a group called CGOC has also investigated this, you come up with, some pretty incredible numbers in terms of the amount of junk that's floating around organizations right now. But trying to get your arms around that, try to get your handle on that. It's easy to identify junk in somebody else's department, but God forbid you come into my department and say that this information is no longer relevant. That's a pretty challenging dimension for people. So another sign, as we talked about this, is that I asked this from a process perspective, because what I was trying to get at is that information governance isn't just this abstract thing. It's not just kind of good hygiene for the sake of hygiene, but it really needs to be viewed in the context of what are the implications of having unstructured, ungoverned information in the context of actually trying to get the work of the organization done. And so these are the percentages. You can see them here in terms of organizations that say managing unstructured information is a challenge in this process. And you can see on all these, over 50%, some hitting up to 60, 65%. But, you can look at these processes and you can almost guess. You look at this and you can get a really clear idea of the role that unstructured information plays in these key processes. A lot of documents, a lot of images, a lot of things that are not conventional in terms of the way that you view things from a data perspective. So the last data point that I wanted to tee up is this one, which is how hard do people think this problem is? How difficult do they think it is to solve it? And we get this a lot in a lot of the surveys that we do, where you ask folks, do you agree or disagree with a particular business problem that ties to information? And you get some, pretty enthusiastic eyes in that process. But then when you ask the question of what are you actually doing about it, you usually bump up against a data point like this, that people are struggling with the question that, yes, the problem is incredibly important. Yes, it's growing. Yes, it's tied to business process inefficiency. But it's, as you can see here, this 43% of the people in the red bars that responded here said they considered it either an impossible or a very difficult task. And I think one of the things that I'd like Mike to talk a little bit about is why this doesn't need to be an impossible task. What are some of the things that you can consider? What are some of the approaches that you can consider that you can start to make progress? Because making progress is critical in terms of keeping your organization competitive. So, Mike, why don't you talk a little bit about some of these and give people a good idea, I think, of some steps and some starting points in creating a manageable information governance process.
Sure, and it does seem very difficult, but the good news is that there is technology out there that can help reduce that difficulty dramatically. And one of the things that you really want to try to do is identify business complete data. If you do a search in just any file share, you'll find version 1, version 2 drafts of documents and things like that. And if you, what you really want to try to do is have an official record that's identifying the official the final version of a contract that will give you a better business process overall. Once you're able to do that, you may have to keep some of the other data, but you can push it out of the way. In order to do that, you have to be able to tag the data and extract key metadata out of the documents. And there are both simple heuristic rules you can apply, but even more importantly now, machine learning that you can apply to this problem and various different use cases. The other thing that you can do is make sure that your users have access to that business complete data or that latest version of the document in the context of where they're actually looking for it. So if they're in Salesforce or they're in SAP, serve up the document they need. Don't make them go back to email and try to find the right document. They're invariably going to find the wrong one. So actually push the document to them. And you can scan your legacy content, but it's actually a lot easier if you develop systems to capture that content intelligently and continuously improve that capture mechanism as you go. And of course, another thing that you want to think about is that in the past, up until GDPR and privacy regulations came to us, we tended to think of our retention policy as static, okay? And now we are having a challenge because there is a conflict between keeping content as long as you can, which a lot of business users want to do, and the privacy concerns that say that you should only keep it as long as you actually need it. And so people need that flexibility, and they need to be able to have the data tagged correctly. This is impossible on a manual basis. Nobody's going to do it unless it's automated. So we want to bring automation to that.
Mike, particularly with regards to that last point, maybe you could talk a little bit about the complexity that organizations at scale face, because lots of times we say, you talk to people and you'll say like, oh, we have a GDPR problem, or we have a particular problem with, some financial services regulation or whatever. But the thing that, really strikes me as to one of the reasons why manual approaches don't work anymore is that if you're in any organization in just about any industry, you've got industry-specific requirements, locality-specific requirements, you've got international, you've got, all sorts of it's such a complicated task.
And data sovereignty too. Yep. And the part of the problem is, like, you just look at GDPR in particular, or any of the privacy regulations. If you say, okay, what data do I have about this customer? You can go into your customer support application, or you can go in your sales database. What a lot of people don't recognize is how much unstructured data is floating out there that may identify a customer and they don't even realize it. So what a lot of the tools are able to do these days is actually look for sensitive data and actually tag that it contains it, but also extract it so that we can actually, when we do a data subject request, we're able to pull that back and demonstrate that we have done a thorough job of identifying all that content. We may not actually delete it as part of a deletion request because we may need it as part of our business, but at least we know we have it, and that will help us reduce risk substantially. And forgetting about your file shares and all the laptops that you have out there is a big mistake.
Yeah, and then I realized I committed one of my cardinal sins, which is use an acronym without explaining it, and I said GDPR, and for those that aren't familiar, that's the privacy regulation in Europe that basically governs how information is handled. And one of the things that really struck me when AIM was going through its GDPR requirements, you think an organization like AIM, fairly small organization, how complicated could it be? And it was extraordinarily complicated to figure out where that information was, what systems it was in, how it was protected, how you got rid of it if somebody asked you to do it. All those things were extraordinarily complicated, and that's for a little nonprofit in the United States, not to mention an organization that operates at huge scale. I mean, it's many magnitudes of order more complex in most organizations. So let's shift gear, and I want to talk about some vulnerability points, if you will, Mike. I did some research last year, kind of looking at some of these, and I just want to tee some of these up for you and kind of get your take on them. And what I basically came to the conclusion is that governance failures are occurring at 3 pressure points, and so the pressure points that I see. The first one is what you talked about just a second ago, Mike, in terms of capture and intelligent capture and information coming into an organization. And by the way, I'm actually in the process of launching a survey on intelligent capture, so keep your eyes out for that. We'd love to get your take on that out in the audience. But we asked this point, digitizing and standardizing business inputs is one of the key bottlenecks for digital transformation. And what you can see here, bottom 2 bars, 86% basically agree with that. And the reason I think that's important is that, we didn't just ask a tactical question there. I was specifically trying to test this question of the automation and capture of business inputs tied to a big organizational goal like digital transformation. And so people understand that flow of information, that 4.2x coming into the organization, 62% unstructured, getting your handle around that is a necessary precondition to a transformation strategy. So that's kind of pressure point 1, information coming in. So pressure point 2 is this point here, which and it's a little different than the actual point on the slide. This shows, this is a question of, how do you ensure that personal information in email, SharePoint, share drives, is deleted when appropriate. And what you can see here, if you look at those little colored charts there in blue and in red, is that basically 6 out of 10 organizations approach this on a manual basis. And so the vulnerability that occurred to me in this, and the key pressure point that occurs to me, is at the extreme endpoints of information in organization. There's a huge vulnerability for most organizations. So vulnerability on the one side, information coming in, trying to put that in a predictable digital flow, and information vulnerability on the back end because information tends to diffuse through the organization. And so that's number 2. And then the third one that I just wanted to highlight is just this question of how do you know what you know? How do you know what you don't know? And, I asked a question that focused on something that you would think would be pretty basic for most organizations, which is this question of just managing the information associated with policy compliance. So we're not even talking about the information itself, but the information associated with compliance. And what you can see here is just keeping up with the regulations, managing the paper and the documents and everything else is a huge challenge. And I've also noticed that with something like GDPR, even taking the GDPR requirements that are embedded in a long document and translating that into something that's actionable on the part of an organization is a huge challenge. So those 3 things, information coming in, pressure point, information at the end points of an organization is a pressure point, and then managing the information associated and being able to demonstrate policy compliance, I think, is another vulnerability. And so I'll switch this off to you now, Mike, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how organizations ought to think about that set of problems.
Well, I tend to think of it very holistically, and there's a lot of I'm quite struck by most people are doing it not at all or manually, and that just is not going to work going forward. If you're having a 4x explosion in data every 2 years, that is really going to wreck your ability to say that you've got risk management. And so there are a number of different things. Some of these things I've talked about already about reducing rot, but being able to promote accurate data, I talked about. I really want to emphasize being able to tag data appropriately, both the legacy data that you've already got, come up with a plan for dealing with that, and as it comes in. Now, some of that can be done through content services, through a document management system, but it's very difficult to get that implemented in a lot of large enterprises. And so what you really need is some agent that is looking at this data proactively and is figuring out what it is, whether it needs to be secured, what repository even to put it in, what is the business context of it, and then to give users the relevant way in which to retrieve the right data at the right time, and of course to deny that retrieval at the right time based on who they are and the security of the document. And of course, to have automated controls that are going to help you comply with the overall information governance policy and the retention policy. The summary on this is be prepared. You have to attack it on multiple fronts all the time. And if you do that, you'll be able, if you think about it that way, you'll be able to incrementally improve your information governance and your risk management plan.
I think that the one point that really strikes me, and you mentioned it earlier, and you have it on this slide too, is that one in the middle under presenting relevant data in context to folks. That is, I think, so important. I've seen in a lot of our surveys, a huge expectation on the part of knowledge workers that, many systems sort of expect that knowledge workers are going to be like these weird human systems integrators, that swivel from one screen to another and take information from one system, a content management system, and then kind of flip it over here and have to manually transfer it into a line of business system. And I think that's a legacy of some of the content management approaches in the past, which were process specific. And when you got outside of those processes, things got a little hairy. It's also a legacy, I think, DAS systems that many folks keep that information within that system rather than in an agnostic repository.
Yeah, and what it does is it actually invites the person to go into their email and email it to somebody else or even to themselves to keep it. And what does that do? It extends the retention of a document that you never intended in the first place. So if you make that document easy to retrieve and everybody knows how to get to it within the app, then they're less likely to get into that repeating of information.
And it like accelerates the rot problem because you have multiple copies then floating around. It accelerates the endpoint problem because it's you've lost control, and there's just such huge opportunity just even on that one of those 6 little boxes that you had there to relieve pressure by addressing it directly. So last point, I know I've been a little bit woe is me, this is really hard, all that kind of stuff. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the upside, which is that, we have moved into an environment in which there are automation tools available that weren't around 5 or 10 years ago. And talk a little bit about that for a few minutes. So first of all, do people care? And so we asked this question about whether, how important would it be to your competitiveness? Again, I tried to position this as a high-order value within the organization. If you could transform the processes that you use for information protection and compliance and automate the processing of that information. And what you can see here is that, over 50% cite this as an extremely important thing. So then I think the next thing that I wanted to just share is I took a look then and said, okay, well, how are people doing with automating some of these functions? And this is a little difficult to read, this one, but it's really interesting. The thing to look at in here is that on the left-hand side, you've got a whole lot of different things that automated agents can do in organizations with regards to managing information. And the thing to pay attention to is the length of the red bar in that very top line, which was 5 years ago. I asked that same question, and the length of that bar right now, which is the blue bar, and that difference between 48% and 13%, I think represents a growing appetite to try and adapt automated tools to handle some of these. And that's good news because there's a receptivity to that. I think when you start looking at what kinds of use cases people are looking at, a lot of AI and machine learning initiatives out there, and when you start asking, what are the kinds of content-centric AI and machine learning use cases out there, you can see some of the ones that I think play a direct role on some of those 6 functions that Mike talked about a little while ago in terms of intelligently capturing, in terms of actually understanding the content of a document, so that you can then put it into context, and so that you can, also use automatic tools to help the classification process. Because the idea of some crazy set of end users applying metadata manually to information is just never going to happen. And so you got to figure out ways to do that automatically. And so the last piece that I just wanted to share with regards to data, and then give Mike a little bit of a chance to talk a little bit more at length about some of the approaches to this, is this intersection that is starting to occur, and it's not completely there yet, but people do understand that the intersection is coming between AI and machine learning and the task of information governance, and that information governance increasingly has to be baked in, has to be automatic. You think about the title of this webinar, it increasingly has to be taken out of the hands of knowledge workers because they have enough challenge getting their own work done. Never mind thinking about all those cool records management and information governance things that we like to talk about. And so it's a revolutionary moment, I think, for organizations that we're just on the cusp of right now. So, Mike, let me hand it over to you and talk a little bit about that question of automation and, some of the issues and approaches that people ought to think about.
Sure. So one thing I noticed in that data was the very high focus on security in there. And this is really what's driving a lot of the projects that are going on. It's the justification because the risk is off the charts for a lot of these organizations. And there's several different approaches to this, and there are different software categories depending on the use case. But in a way, they all kind of come down to a problem of auto-classification. So there's auto-classification software generically, and a lot of this is embedded in content services so that as somebody's filing something or they're putting it in a document management system, it can automatically figure out what that document is. SharePoint has some similar types of capabilities around digital rights management. But there's some other use cases where different workflows are needed. I'm going to go through these on file analysis and intelligent capture in a minute. We talked a lot about integrated content services before about presenting the document in situ, but also actually making the content services available from within the application so that we're actually extending something like SAP or Salesforce to have its own document management capabilities built in to use cases it normally didn't in the past. We can also do this on the archiving end, and we can make that content more refined. We can add metadata at that point. We can combine it with structured information. And of course, if all else fails on the risk end, eDiscovery for many years has been using technology-assisted review and machine learning to classify the content and just take the labor out of being able to review it after it's gone into that risk phase of the life cycle. So let's take a quick look at a couple of use cases. Intelligent capture is a growing area. So we've always had workflows around capturing images and incoming documents and faxes. But now what we're doing is, instead of just looking at the document type, we're looking at other factors in that content. So we're looking at the contract value. We're looking for privacy information. Not only does it have privacy information, but what is that information? The actual social security number or the credit card number. Now, we need that, but we also want to mask it from users who are retrieving it. So we have to properly file this so we can put the right business rules on it. But if we actually capture that, we can relate it to business processes downstream, and we can do a much better job of securing the document, complying with data subject requests, complying with risk, with legal holds and so forth, and being able to narrow down what you're looking for in a lot easier way. Now, this is in the context of an automated capture process, such as maybe a loan application or some other process of that sort. Now, another way to look at it, and this is a very similar workflow, but the difference here is the source. The source is all those legacy file shares that you have, and you want to get a handle on everything you've had for the past, umpteen years. You may have 20 years worth of file data that you have to look at and assess for risk and get under control. But you also have to take into consideration all of the new information that's being produced. And with file sync and share now, Dropbox and Office 365, you really do have a major problem in being able to determine what's in your unstructured data. It's just an ongoing process, and you need to have some business rules placed around that. And this is file analysis is really wrapped around that particular use case and has connectors into the file sync and share processes and services. Now, another example of this is our customer, Black Sea Trade and Development Bank, and this has been going on for a number of years in the banking industry, and it's really expanding to other industries as we go, and that's the use case of email monitoring. So in the financial services industry, we have regulations that require us to monitor email and file it, but we also want to be able to reuse that information, but we can't do that unless we have a proper accounting of what is in that content. So if does it have privacy information in it? Is it a risk? Is it a risky activity that somebody's carrying out? These are the types of things that we need to look at, and we don't want to do that after the fact, after the event has already occurred or after the legal hold has been placed. We want to try to identify that on an ongoing basis, and that's what Black Sea is doing with their email monitoring application. So those are just some examples of the type of automation that's possible. And one thing I do want to point out is that machine learning is being inserted in all of these processes because now it's a lot easier to embed AI in these processes than ever before. And you'll see more and more that in addition to just simple business rules, you'll be able to insert adaptive machine learning into the process to improve the accuracy of it and come up with new use cases. And if you want to learn more about what opentext has and what our solutions are about, you can go to opentext.com/infogov, and we'll lead you to our particular suite of applications and content services that address these issues.
Thanks, Mike. That's terrific. And while Teresa tees up some of the questions for us, I had a couple, if it's okay, I'd like to ask you just a couple questions that occurred to me along the way.
Sure, go right ahead, John.
The first one is just a point that I've kind of thought for a while, and I'd just be interested in your take, Mike, is that, when you talk about the kind of triple crown of privacy, governance, and security, information privacy, information governance, information security, I thought for some time that, while they're all important and while there is an awful lot of overlap between them, that a lot of folks in our space have missed an opportunity by not tying a lot of these directly to information security, because that's such a huge worry about organizations right now. Does that make sense to you, or am I just kind of imagining that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And the interesting thing is if you focus on the information security, you'll realize that there are opportunities to go further than that. Just identifying why it's secure. Is this secure because it's HR data, or is this secure because it's a credit card application? You have gone pretty far with that. Is it secure because somebody in customer support typed a social security number into a field in a database that they should have never done so? Right. Now you've got a training problem that you've got to deal with too. So just by using that highly important security as a driver for your process, you'll identify and actually build out the automation plumbing you need in your IT organization to solve other more nuanced problems.
The other one that I just wanted to ask quickly, Mike, is that, you talked, and I think it's a really interesting point, you talked about disposition, about retention, about governance, and the way that we've always historically thought of that is by document type. And I think what you were also implying there is, as we apply more AI tools and machine learning tools to, what's in those repositories and what's in those documents, we're starting to do those functions now in context. So in the context of the value of a contract you mentioned and the context of the particular privacy needs. So maybe talk a little bit about that, because that's a pretty cool and changing point, I think.
Yes. So, if I can do a little bit of a pitch, the way we approach document management back in the 90s and the 2000s was very much around being able to provide our users with a document management system, and they had to file something and fill out a profile. And that works in the legal industry and maybe other professional services, but what we know is for the vast majority of organizations, that just does not capture enough information. And so what our approach has been is to provide content services that are deeply integrated with a number of different applications. We have a very rich suite of capabilities that are built into SAP in particular, and we have services and capabilities that are built to drive content management and document management directly into the user's line of work. So while they're actually doing other tasks and they think they're using really a structured data application like Salesforce, when in fact they're actually filing content. And when we're able to tie that into the context of what they're doing, the customer record, we can get a lot better initial metadata, and we can also refine how we look at sentiment. So, for example, sentiment analysis is a lot more accurate for the AI system if we understand the context in which it's coming. So we can look at yes, no, true, false across an entire file share, but if we know it's a customer service request or a mortgage application, now we can do the much more important task of figuring out what that sentiment really means.
I want to step in with a question that has come in here, but before I get to that, I just want to let everyone in the audience know that there is an ebook that we've published on this very topic, and we consider it a companion to what we've been listening to in this webinar today. And the link to that ebook is in the resources section, but also when you download a PDF of the slides and the resources, this slide will link to that page where you can get a hold of that ebook. So there's a lot of really good interesting facts and information and just a good perspective in that ebook as well. So I just wanted to point that out to everyone. Now I'm going to pop back here to a question that's come in, and I'm pulling up the slide that it relates to. And Mike, I want to start with you, but John, feel free to join in with this. Because I know at the beginning, John was talking about businesses recognize, yes, there's rot. We know we're supposed to get rid of it. But no one is actually doing it, and you have this great chart here of all of these different perspectives to automate the intelligent information governance. And Mike, your thoughts of for the people that are reluctant to pull the trigger or to just start doing this, or just haven't been doing this, where should someone start?
Well, there are two places to start here, and they're both on the left. The first is around file analysis software, which the nice thing about file analysis is you can start by just building a database of tags around what the content is. It doesn't move it. It doesn't secure it. It doesn't do anything in particular except capture what it sees. And you can do some testing around that and build up a database. But the other thing that you can do is file analysis software invariably has a policy management engine in it that can actually direct the information. So, for example, if you do have a tranche of data that is identified as sensitive information, you can redirect that into a secure repository. You can get it off of OneDrive or Dropbox or whatever and push it into a secure area immediately and get rid of that risk. Now, you can do that without having a content services suite. But if you have a proper content services platform, then you can begin to build on that so that you can have a place that properly stores the metadata with the document, and you can begin to build up services that identify the document on the way in and push it into the right place without losing the context of retrieval for it as you go. So that's where I'd say to start. The easy start is file analysis, and certainly a bigger lift, but a important starting point is to have a content services platform.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. I think where you were going just a second ago with this question of identifying information on the way into the organization. That becomes so important when the scale is rising logarithmically to To just somehow, start to manage the curve. Because if you don't start doing that, then you're in like that boat that has a hole in the bottom, and you're constantly bailing water out and never getting anywhere. So I really like what you say about file analysis capabilities and then kind of an integrated platform to handle it.
Well, thanks. And just, again, reminding you of our companion ebook that we have here. And just also want to let everybody in our audience know that AIIM offers live instructor-led training as well as online self-paced classes on a variety of topics. And we can even arrange for a trainer to come to your place of business to provide a custom perspective of our instructor-led programs. And then there's also AIIM's Certified Information Professional designation, and we also offer review classes to help you prepare for that exam. And I do know that we are in the process of releasing the next generation of the CIP exam, and the beta is still open right now. And if you do have any questions about that, contact training@aim.org, and we'll be able to help you to take the beta exam so that you can be on the ground floor of that. So looking forward for that program to be fully released very soon. But the certification is dedicated to enhancing and promoting the profession of information management, and all of this is so very valuable to us. So information on everything can be found at aim.org/training. But do also ask you to consider our CIP and to even take our beta exam. And since we're getting to the end of our webinar time, I just want to remind everyone that we have recorded this webinar, and so you'll be able to come back and catch it again and pick up even more tips and great things along the way. Do download the resources. Please take the feedback survey. I very much want to thank our underwriter, OpenText. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM would not be able to bring you these free educational programs. So OpenText, thank you very much for your sponsorship. And as we bring this webinar to a close, I do want to leave you with our speaker's closing thoughts. And so I'm going to start first with Mike Safar from OpenText. Your closing thoughts today.
Okay, well, I think the key theme I want to get across here is that you must automate in order to tackle all this information. And in order to do that, you need to find ways to identify and capture metadata around your unstructured information or apply it. And then from there, you'll be able to take advantage of these automation and machine intelligence capabilities.
Thank you, Mike. And John Mancini of AIM, your closing thoughts today.
Sure, thank you. I want to just harken back to this slide for a second because, and the point of this slide is that it's not time for business as usual. There's been an inflection both in the quantity of information as well as the variety of information coming into organizations. You can't stay ahead of that anymore by manual processes. You have to automate it. And this chart reminds me a lot of charts that I've had previously talking, for example, about cloud computing, in which we went through a long period in which it was like, no way in our organization, no way in our organization, no way in our organization. Then all of a sudden flip. Yes, we're hybrid. And so I think that's kind of a flip is going on right now in terms of automating the governance process. So it's time to be bold, I would say.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. For AIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you with our next webinar. And have a real good afternoon.